As always, the wheels of time are constantly turning. A number of hit modern-era shonen, like My Hero Academia and Jujutsu Kaisen, have finished their serializations, so it's only natural that shonen fans are looking for what might be the next big series. And one such contender is Kaiju number 8. When I first picked up Kaiju number 8, I was cautiously optimistic. It initially appeared as though the story had done a few little things to separate itself from its shonen predecessors. The main character, Kafka, is a 33-year-old man whose dreams had essentially fizzled out by the beginning of the story. He wants nothing more than to be at the top of an elite kaiju hunting organization and fulfill his promise to a childhood friend. Unfortunately, he's failed repeatedly because of a seeming lack of talent and winds up as a sanitation worker instead. Until one day, he swallows what seems like a small parasitic kaiju and gains unmatched strength, speed, and other useful abilities that he can now use to achieve his dreams. The series had a lot of similarities to other stuff I've read, but it also seemed like it was working with some cool ideas, so I was hopeful. Now that I'm all caught up, I can comfortably say that the series is mediocre at best. First things first, the story is weak. The protagonist doesn't have any particularly strong or unique motivations. He wants to join the Kaiju hunting corps because it's his childhood dream to be a hero, and he wants to do it by the side of his childhood friend because they were especially close. Nothing to really write home about. The plot is incredibly predictable and will never take a turn you don't expect. The villains feel underdeveloped, and their generally boring designs don't help matters. The power system isn't unique at all and doesn't make for interesting combat scenarios, nor does it contribute to the themes of the story in any way. Even the way Kafka got his powers is just incredibly boring. Some mini kaiju finds him and forces its way into his mouth, and he's eerily quick to just accept it. He doesn't question it for as long as he should. He doesn't investigate where this thing came from or what it wanted. It's not even mentioned at all by Kafka afterwards, as though it's just another plot point that we need to get through. And we don't get any context on what this thing is for another 115 chapters. So Midoriya ate hair, sure, but at least Midoriya earned it by performing a heroic act and unintentionally proving himself a worthy successor, even if the act itself was questionable. Yuji eating Sukuna's finger is not only fun setup for the main villain, but it's also a decision Yuji himself was willing to make, and one that constantly comes back to bite him in the ass. This, on the other hand, was just boring, and, at least up until fairly recently, told us nothing about Kafka, the kaiju, or the world that they inhabit. It doesn't help at all that the kaiju themselves are boring, and it honestly feels like the series early on was a bit misleading. Sure, I understand that kaiju just means monster in Japanese, and that the term has a slightly different connotation in Japan than in the rest of the world. But regardless of how flexible you believe the term to be, the kaiju genre clearly has its features, and Kaiju number 8 simply doesn't fit in. The main antagonist, for most of the story, uses his intellect and stolen abilities as vital parts of his power set, feeling more like a supervillain than any kind of kaiju. Another notable kaiju is literally just a carbon copy of a supporting character, but with black eyes and a dark color scheme to create a more evil vibe. These creatures would fit better in something like One Punch Man than in any actual kaiju story. If the story itself doesn't turn you away, then the pacing just might. For context, Kaiju number 8 is a monthly manga that comes out with around 20 pages a chapter, which is a relatively few pages for a monthly series. Now, I'm never going to be against this kind of release schedule. It's simply better for an artist's long-term health to have relatively consistent breaks. But by the nature of this kind of schedule, the story by default isn't going to be moving very quickly. This is made even worse by the fact that Naoya Matsumoto, the creator of Kaiju number 8, loves to drag on what is already an uninspired story. I'm not exaggerating here. There are chapters where the plot effectively doesn't move forward at all, even in what should be pivotal moments. Matsumoto loves using things like double spread panels and unnecessary reaction shots that slow down the story even more. It doesn't matter how patient you are, at a certain point it gets ridiculous. Even something as simple as someone being grabbed can take months to play out, and these issues make it harder to connect with some of the story's characters. Side characters like Kaguragi and Izumo basically disappeared from the plot, and even someone as seemingly important as Mina didn't appear for a long stretch of time. She hasn't gotten a truly memorable moment of her own until the current arc, and Kaiju number 8 is over 4 years old. Kafka is a pretty textbook shonen protagonist. Ignore the fact that he's 33 years old, it doesn't reflect on the character much if at all. Nothing about Mina is remarkable. She largely exists as backstory and a goal for Kafka. Kikoru is clearly Matsumoto's favorite character. She gets more focus than any character that isn't Kafka. She's fine. The same powerful, elitist rich girl character archetype with parental issues that you've seen before, but still, she's fine. My only complaint with her is that she gets too much focus, especially when other characters who need more focus like Mina and Reno get next to none. Reno initially feels like a secondary protagonist, but like so many other characters in this story, at a certain point he just kind of stops getting any notable focus. Even his own arc, the arc where he receives the number 6 suit, doesn't feel exceptionally special for the character, because despite him being at the heart of the arc, it's really more about Iharu. A lot of that arc is from Iharu's perspective, and the arc doesn't really give us anything fresh or new to learn about Reno, so it does more to flesh out a side character than maybe the second or third most important character in the story. The character writing in the series might be the worst part. I can honestly say that despite reading the series for over a year now, I don't have any kind of attachment to any of these characters. They largely feel one note and don't have any real big moments that feel meaningful. I mean, sure, they all get one moment to do one shallow thing where they're like, watch me do this, and everyone takes a moment to react and is like, oh man, you're so cool. But these moments don't have any impact. It feels like we're nearing the story's endgame, and yet at the same time it also feels like nothing's happened. It's a very weird feeling. And the fights aren't anything special either. The suits aren't interesting. They're just a shallow way to put abstract power levels on the kaiju hunters. Their power levels are determined by how much of the suit's power they can draw out, but it just feels meh. Every time Mina fights, everyone's like, look at how powerful she is, but she's literally just firing a giant gun. I understand that she's strong because she's drawing out more of her suit's power, but how exactly? And why was the gear designed this way? Why wouldn't they use all their advanced tech to find a way to artificially maximize the power in all their suits and weapons instead of relying on the natural affinity of their soldiers? I understand that the answer is because it's a shonen, but my point is that the way combat power works in this story is both senseless and boring. It doesn't help that a lot of the fights have the exact same formula. Enemy appears. Soldiers initially fight them off. Enemy reveals way to overpower soldier. Cue soldier backstory and then bam, soldier powers up and defeats the monster. Seriously. Number 9's elite kaiju went down so quickly that they didn't feel like much of a threat at all. Characters are often put in perilous situations, but generally make it out alive. With one exception, a character with so many death flags that it felt like he was brought into the plot just to die. But the worst thing about Kaiju number 8, the absolute worst thing, is that it lacks any kind of soul. There is nothing that makes Kaiju number 8 stand out against its predecessors. It's a hodgepodge of every popular, generic trope that's in shonen. Whether you want to talk about plot, setting, tone, the characters, or the power system, it doesn't have anything to stake its name on. A misunderstood underdog who seeks to make a name for himself. The main character being dense and childlike. The main character making contact with some exceptional being to gain a powerful ability that harnesses the power of the antagonistic monsters that they're fighting against. A badass tsundere loli that's powerful and has daddy issues. Their uniform design. Number techniques being spoken every time they fight. Problematic monsters roaming their worlds. The deuteragonists with superior talent. Teen angst everywhere. I want to be clear here. Having common tropes is not bad. Some of my favorite stories have incredibly common tropes, but they still manage to be interesting because they have a particularly unique message or a unique way of offering that message. Sure, the underdog reaching the top despite the world seemingly being against them is a centuries old tale, but Naruto still had fairly thrilling action and storytelling that set it apart. Yeah, Chainsaw Man is ridiculously edgy, and even kind of ugly, but Chainsaw Man's uncanny tone, and the way that the author writes the characters eerily instead of sympathetically, along with some great character writing, set it apart. Whereas Kaiju number 8 has none of that. It feels like it was made in a factory, designed to be as appealing to fans of traditional shonen as possible, without any unique messaging or execution. I'm sure Matsumoto puts a ton of heart and effort into drawing the series, but if he or his author put any heart into writing it, I'm not sure I can feel it. Now, I do like traditional shonen, so despite everything I've said in this video thus far, I do like catching up to Kaiju number 8 every once in a while. So why does this series kinda bug me? Because I can't help but feel like this series promised something it almost immediately abandoned. Kafka is a 33-year-old man whose dreams were dashed because of a critical lack of talent, now working a very necessary but incredibly unglamorous job as a sanitation worker. Even worse, his closest friend is now effectively living their dream without him. This initial idea alone sets him apart from other protagonists. He was so damn easy to empathize with and root for, but it's all abandoned incredibly early on. When was the last time him being a kaiju sanitation worker even came up? When you look at the way that the story panned out, it makes you question why the author even made him so old to begin with. You could easily make Kafka, say, 18, and very little would change. The author might have thought that making him 33 would make Kafka stand out, and it did at first, before he reverted to writing a bog-standard teenage protagonist. And that's pretty much what Kaiju number 8 is. An incredibly fun first few minutes, followed up by what feels like a factory-made shonen. But that's all for now. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. It really helps me out, and I'll see you guys next time.